Bonjour, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Et même,
Hello everyone, and even good evening for some of you who are joining us from Asia, or good morning to those who are joining us from the Americas. So you're going to see that we're going to be able to get this webinar kicked off on time. So we're going to be able to get started as regards the challenges that climate change face, that we face trying to fight climate change and extreme events, whether we're talking about droughts or flooding. And in the past weeks, we've all seen, for example, that there's been different images, one after the other, of different catastrophes. We've had floods in California, Australia, droughts in Brazil, and we've seen that there's been extreme weather in the south west of France, and the river Niger has overflown. And so in the face of all these dramatic events, we know the economic, agricultural, social and health impacts of climate change, because water is obviously the first victim of climate change. We're getting quite used to saying that. So how should we adapt to climate change? With what funding and with what economic argumentation when we're talking about spending right now to protect ourselves against current day and future risk that might not be seen quite the same way by decision makers and those in government. So we're talking about the cost of taking measures versus the cost of inaction. Basically, why should we act now rather than wait? And the point of view of the river basins within this question, and we actually feel privileged because this is an integrated question and comes into the use of all of the hydraulic resources, because we're talking about natural resources, the river basin itself that's impacted by climate change, and also points of view that have been documented because of the points of view of the river basin organisations that often feed into most complex information systems, even if we still have a long way to go in terms of our work on this subject matter. And so we're going to basically invite reflections and witness accounts of what's going on at river basin level. First, I'm going to give the floor to Madam Samira Erawad, who's the director of the river basin in Cebu in the Kingdom of Morocco. And I would remind you that it's the Kingdom of Morocco that's actually leading the International Association of River Basins since October 2019, when we held our last assembly in Marrakesh. Entonces, Samia, you can now basically get this debate going for us. Thank you. You have the floor, Samia. Thank you, Eric. Hello, everyone. I'm obviously very, very happy to be with you in this seminar organised by Europe. And obviously the presidency at the moment is under our presidency since the last General Assembly in Marrakesh. It was a very successful one, I might add. And there was the international seminar on water security, and it was closed by a Marrakesh declaration on the use of water resources, and that has basically been the basis of different axes that are very, very essential in terms of water management. Is that good? Is that fine? Can everyone see me? I think you just have to share the screen. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Great. So as I was saying, there was the International Summit on Water Security that was organised in March of last year at the summit, International Summit on Water Security. And it was actually closed by the Marrakesh Declaration, which is basically a declaration aimed at a participative and innovative water or river basin management. It's management of water and energy. And it's the challenges of adaptation to climate change that were amongst the different topics that were the centre of discussions. The knowledge, innovation and sharing of information, water diplomacy, international and trans-border cooperation for water security and financing of water security. We have to make sure that all of these measures are available on an international scale, and I would like to say that all of this takes place in an exceptional context of 2020, the end of 2019 in fact, which is the COVID-19 pandemic that's affected absolutely everyone, and that's meant that we've had to impose restrictions worldwide in terms of meeting up with people, in terms of going out and about, but it's always, and it's still, an opportunity to basically underline the importance of access to water, water resources and running water. And I think that in spite of the constraints that were imposed by the pandemic, we have to continue to work and to innovate for basically equal water resource sharing. And I think that in terms of climate change and its impact on water resources, Morocco at the moment is actually experiencing the results of a drought that started last year, and we have a rainfall deficit of more than 50% in some regions. And we can see in the Cebu River Basin, there's been this deficit of 23% from the year 2019-2020. And so this is obviously due to a reduction in water inflow, water input. And we can see that there's not been this groundwater recharge. And that's why we have to work on security and access to water for all of its usages. And we can see that there's been the rise in use of water, and we can see that this is basically based on the high temperatures that have gone on longer than normal. As we can see that this is a tendency for dry and hotter weather and less humidity. And so we can see that this has basically brought about these changes, and we've basically carried out a specific study on our basin, or our Cebu water basin, and we've tried to basically foresee the different conditions that the GIEC, the group of experts, international group of experts on climate, have helped us with. And we can see that there's this reduction of waterfall, rainfall, and this is basically something that we can see. It's a tendency we've been able to confirm, and it's a challenge that we have to meet in the coming years. Of course, the impact of climate change has its impact on running water. We have a lot of fragile water supply in our country. Many of them are based on groundwater recharge systems, and so we can see that that is obviously a risk for water security, and we really need to work on irrigation for agriculture, because this is a pillar of the economy in Morocco, which basically lives off agriculture. So it's very important to us, and we have to basically work on reducing the extreme conditions that are obviously linked to climate change, both indirect and direct, that are very notable indeed. And we can see that we have to limit these impacts because they have a profound effect on our socio-economic development. And we can see that there's been this policy by His Majesty Hassan II, who actually enforced these big water barriers, and we can see that we have 9 of these, where we've got 10 litres of water, 10 square litres that can be actually held there. And we can see that the policy has been marked by the adaptation of our first law on water. Before then, it was different texts that were scattered here and there, but since then we were able to adopt a law that came into force in 2016, and this is a law that basically we can find has certain particularities, and there's been different concepts that have been brought forward by this new law. Non-conventional use of water resources are limited, for example, and we can see that these alternatives to use of natural resources and desalination of salt water so as to be able to have new sources of drinkable water. And we can see that we've got to work on the groundwater recharge systems, and we have to basically use these strategies that we can go to in moments of severe drought so as to preserve the superficial surface waters and the groundwater surface waters. And I think that we have to really have this water shortage or drought program. We have to be able to face up to the impacts of climate change on water management, and we have to have a national system where we share information and where we communicate information between different institutions that can help us take better decisions as and when necessary, and to better inform and raise awareness amongst the public in general as regards their use of water resources. We also have to reinforce our policies of water usage, because it's all very well to have these management policies, but we have to make sure that they're respected, and we have to do that through strict controls. And so this new law has brought with it a new entity, which is the Council of the River Basin, and it's run by the state and public establishment and 2/3 of water users. And so we can see that this Water Basin Council is actually quite a large platform to take into account the opinions of all of those who are involved, all the stakeholders involved. And so we can see that the use of water resources in Morocco is based on planning. And so obviously we have to get better at planning. And we're talking about 30-year plan for medium and long term for the National Plan for Water and the PDAIRE, and we can see that's the integrated management plan that works on with the 10 different agencies that work on water basin in Morocco, and each of those implements the plan at their local level. And we can see that first off we have to make sure that we're able to satisfy water requirements now and from here to 2050. And so we're talking about water supply for drinking water, for the ecosystem, and for agriculture in general, and we have to accompany socio-economic development in our country with these important measures. And so obviously we have to be able to support productive activity in our country, and basically we're all focused on this action plan on 4 basic pillars. So we're going to continue working on these barriers, and we can see all of these dams. There's 9 more dams, 9 bigger dams that are going to actually be built between now and 2015. We're talking about 5 million cubic meters of water that's going to be able to be stored there. And so together with our national plan for water use and irrigation, we're talking about 80% of water usage that's mobilised towards irrigation, and we have to really better manage our agricultural practices so as to put less pressure on our water usage. The same with drinking water. And so, as I said, we're talking about preserving groundwater recharge systems, and we have to make sure that we take care of natural areas and reuse water. And so the last axis is basically prevention plans and management for when we have shortages and droughts. So it's true that climate change is obviously making the extreme weather conditions we're already suffering from worse. And we can see that this happens with all actors involved in different usage of the water basin, and so we have to become more resilient. And in the face of this climate change, we have to basically urge people to be economic in their use of water. We have to support projects for reusing and collecting rainwater. We basically have to support these measures. The Moroccan government will pay up to 80% of implementation of these projects. And so we have to be able to foresee large capacity for storage of rainwater, and obviously the dams that I've already spoken about. And we have to make sure that we are reusing salt water so as to make more secure the water supply in our big cities. That's Casablanca, Agadir, Hoceima, amongst others. And so we have a big project to transfer water from the north to the south, because the south has a deficit of certain structures, and so we have to make sure that there's solidarity plans even just between the north and the south of Morocco. And so I think we're going to be able to accompany all of these measures with these policies to raise awareness amongst the public at large, so as that we're able to make our water management more sustainable, and we're able to share our resources in a more effective way. And so we haven't yet disassociated our plan with the additional measures, or to the additional measures that I've spoken about, and we have to start them all as of today, so as to be able to basically meet the growing demands for use of water. And so what are the financing methods we have in mind? Well, it's the state budget, obviously, for building dams, for all of the works, the hydro, agricultural sector works. So it's the general state budget, and then there's a contribution by users as regards to tariffs that they pay to use this water. And then we're going to obviously work to promote the reuse of water and the reduction in water that's polluted, and we want to obviously work on anti-irrigation and desalination projects. And we're going to look to donors for these kinds of funds. Morocco's already benefited from this type of fund, so as to be able to build dams and preserve water resources which are currently unable to meet irrigation requirements. And so basically that's where we are in Morocco at the moment as regards climate change, water resources, and the measures that we are preparing at the moment and which are currently underway, so as to try and come to an integrated and sustainable water management of our water basins, and a governmental and state strategy on that same question. Thank you very much, Eric. I'm here if you need to ask me any questions.
Thanks a lot, Samira. Thanks, Madam Director, for this comprehensive presentation of the Moroccan situation in this specific basin, with a very illustrative and enlightening overview of the key figures on the impacts of climate change on water resources in Morocco, and all the existing links with public policies, planning tools, infrastructures, and how these are financed. For the second part of our webinar, I will now give the floor to Mr. Alain Bernard from the Technical Secretariat of INBO, the International Office for Water. Alain Bernard is one of the experts of the International Office for Water on integrated water resource management. Alain, I leave you the floor to introduce our speakers and moderate the upcoming panel. Thanks a lot. Hello everyone. I see a lot of familiar names and faces in the audience, and it truly is a pleasure to count you among us and to be with you today. Thank you to Eric Tardieu and Samira El-Awat for these introductory remarks, for this already broad overview on water management at the level of hydrographic basins and in the importance of climate change adaptation measures. When we talk about climate change, a clear distinction has to be made between two aspects. On one side we have mitigation, which aims to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and this topic is relatively far from our mandate of water management professionals. Robust studies suggest that the global domestic product could lose around 400 billion euros per year by 2050. That is, if we remain in the current trend scenario, a business as usual scenario regarding climate change mitigation. Investing to really mitigate climate change would be much less expensive.
So the gap between the costs potentially incurred and the trend scenario and the costs being incurred in a proactive scenario ultimately reflects the cost of inaction. So in addition to mitigation, we have the second aspect of climate change, on the other hand, that comes back to us, which basically is the adaptation. So mitigation is a global objective that must be shared by all the countries, but adaptation must be carried out more locally. The effects of climate change are being felt basically in all our basins, so that's why we must adapt quickly. So we are organizing this webinar on the 13th of October, which is the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And we all know that one of the major concerns is the frequency and the intensity of extreme events, so particularly droughts and floods. Their number has doubled in 20 years on this planet, and we all live this reality in our different basins. 10 days ago in the south of France, basically less than 80 kilometers from here, we have suffered with the storm Alex, which caused considerable loss of life and destruction. So basically we had losses up to 1.5 billion euros in an area that was very heavily urbanized. So there's a lot to be done to anticipate the future and to adapt correctly. Everything will not be applicable everywhere all the time. So resilience, the nature-based solutions such as flood expansion zones, nature in the city, agroecology, the demand management, the good governance, all this is very costly, but not considering it is likely to cost much more. So in concrete terms, our main presentations will be talking about the professional experience of the speakers related to the impact of climate change in their basins, their countries, etc. They'll be talking about their experiences related to the forecasting scenarios, the evolutions, and the decision taken about the economic and environmental approach. So we have oriented our speakers. So two following questions. So does the current knowledge allow you to define sufficiently credible scenarios of evolution in terms of water resources? And the second question is, have you made the comparisons between what we call the trend scenario, business as usual, and another scenario that shows a more ecological voluntarism? So what conclusions do you draw from this? And now I'm going to give the floor to Madame Caroline Joigneau, who is the head of projects in the French Association Basin elected representatives. So I'm going to give you the floor. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Good morning to all of you. So I just work in the French National Association of Basin Elected Representatives, basically. So it's a network of all types of organizations, and we represent them in the different works. So their main mission basically is just to work on a global and integrated management of the water and the basin. So to be more concrete, so basically we're just talking about improving the knowledge and the expertise to carry out studies and to carry out studies about water and climate. We are in charge on planification, planning and the management, the water management, basically all of the projects of water management. Basically, we have different types of instruments to do this, and we manage basically all the different systems of restoration and the ecological works. So which shows that the water is just perceived as a cost, but we need to carry out all the messages of integrated management. So between all these organizations that are a member of our network, many just carry out prospective studies and approaches on midterm of the impact of climate change on the water resources, the evolution of the needs in water and different uses and the different management modalities to determine. So basically, they need to work on just getting back to a balance of the resources and to make sure that there is a good balance in terms of activities. So all these different approaches are based on different elements. So the first and foremost, we have the findings or the observation that there of tension or pressure on the water resources and all the different challenges that we have. So basically the challenges of multi-usage to mid and long term. So we have to work now in order to just prevent any conflicts in the future about the environmental quality and also the different types of energy uses. So all the industrial uses also will need water. So we have to preview this for the future. We need to take in consideration the fact that the territorial situations and in the different basins have different characteristics. So the hydrogeographical and meteorological situation of the different areas is completely different, and so basically here we are in the southeastern part of France, so that's why we need to carry out these prospective studies in our basin. We need to take into account the data, the territorial data, the socio-economic impact, the agricultural activities and all those economic activities that we have in the territory, and to measure the impact that these activities can have on the model of the water management. And we need to coordinate this with tools to study the resilience of the territories, to anticipate and to preview the changes. So basically I wanted to talk about the three different prospect actions that we're carrying out. So basically in the Charente, in the Adour and in the Durance. So these are territories between 10,000 and 17,000 square kilometers in the southeastern part of France, and all three territories basically have carried out prospective studies with different stages. First of all, to establish a prospect diagnosis shared with all the stakeholders in the territory, and because all the stakeholders are going to give their knowledge and their data, we need to be able to characterize the system that we're studying, and we need to be able to just have a comprehensive approach of these different challenges. So basically, these are actions that take time to put in place, but they are absolutely essential for the implementation of the project in the future. So that's why we need to elaborate to put in perspective different scenarios. We'll be talking about this later on. I'm talking about different scenarios in plural, because depending on the different modelings, we will not reach the same conclusions. So basically, these are the different scenarios that the public powers will be based to justify the different choices. These are tools to help the decision making in order to elaborate midterm and long-term strategies. So basically, so all these tools that can be put in place and adapted by the policies linked to water management. So in order to create these models, the different commissions in the different bases are based on different data. The climate, hydro data, so basically the flow data, and also the quality of the water data, basically the different floods that happen, the different levels of water, etc., and also the socio-economic data of the territory, the past trends, being those numbers or experts information, the future trends also that we can extrapolate. So basically there are many variables that we don't have today that can influence the models that are produced. So there is an uncertainty that exists, even though the data are just very clear, but there are many aspects that we don't control. So that's why we create different models and different simulations, and we try to extrapolate and model this. And this extrapolation will serve as a decision-making tool in order to create different scenarios depending on the different criteria that we are based on. So these scenarios are just built with the different stakeholders. It's a shared and transversal cross-cutting action, basically. So we had workshops in Charente about the different issues of the territory planning and the territory challenges, so the different scenarios and the different models. So we have the trend evolution models that are more optimistic, where we can just put choices of adaptation and on a certain territory, or we have extreme scenarios where we are going to identify certain actions in order to raise awareness, and potentially we can go to there. So these evolution scenarios are just adapted to the territory, and they are shared with the different stakeholders. So basically they're presented to the stakeholders. Maybe they don't have exactly the same vision, but basically through this we are just comparing these different scenarios in order to identify the adaptation measures that will be more adapted to a certain territory, in order to be able to measure the costs and the investments that we'll have to take in order to really put in place these measures. So in order to give you more concrete examples of the two different approaches, the business as usual or the ecological voluntarism. So basically here I'm going to give you figures about two territories in order for you to have an example of what this can represent. So in the Atu, they basically have an approach of water management. So basically the stakeholders have estimated the 3.1 million cubic meters of unbalance estimated in 2050. So basically they wanted to reach a balance in 2050 through different actions that have to do with irrigation, of the change of agricultural practices, of the reuse of the treated used waters, and also the water management in order to reduce this unbalance of water resources. So basically they evaluate the different investments related to this to 40 million euros. So this is those who have chosen to really engage in actions in order to respond to the decrease of their water resources. In another territory, which is also in the south of France, is the territory around the Durance Basin. There was a macroeconomic study that was carried out in order to identify all the different uses that are vulnerable. So the uses of water that are will be threatened in the future, and how they can just fight this decrease of water resources. And here you see the data. They are very clear, because here we're just talking about different types of figures here. So here we're talking about 1 million euros, about 100 million euros for hydroelectricity, etc., to billions of euros in industry, for example, and in order to have an impact on the industrial activity. So we are going to send you the PowerPoint, but here we have the different links of these different prospect studies that have been carried out that will allow you to have a cross-cutting view of all these different approaches that we have adopted in the different areas. So thank you very much, Madam Sonia, for these very interesting elements of reflection due to the diversity of the different experiences that you have talked about. So if there are any questions in the Q&A session, so on your last slide you propose to go deeper in the study of the different experiences. Also, and our colleagues from the other institution are with us today, so maybe they can just go deeper in the information, giving us a more complementary information about this study, prospective study for 2050. Thank you very much. Going to continue with the second speech. So thank you very much for your effort, because Mr. Sergio Razeira, he's a Portuguese speaker, but he's going to try to speak in Spanish. He is the director of the agency or foundation of the Piracicaba Basins, Capivari and Giuntai in Brazil. So Sergio, you have 10 minutes.
Buenos días a todos.
Thank you, Alain Bernard. Good afternoon to everyone. It really is a sheer pleasure to just be here with everyone. I'd like to apologize in advance for my difficulties with the language, and I would like to thank you for our long-term collaboration with the Water Office and the Basin Agency from France. I'm going to ask for my friend Eduardo Lea's help in putting my slides up. Maybe you can help me with that, Eduardo. And we'd like to speak a little about the efforts in the different regions in our different basins, PCJ. As you can see, we're based in the southeast of Brazil. We basically border with Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais. You can go on to the next slide, thank you. So you can see that our three small basins, we've got Piracicaba, the biggest one, the Capivari River Basin is in a darker colour, and Jundiaí is in the green tone here. So you can see that the geographic area of these river basins is around 15,000 square kilometres of surface areas, and there's actually 5.8 million people living there, and it's the third most industrialised region in the country that generates 7% of Brazil's PIB, or GDP rather, and we're talking about 4 dams that are called the Savannas system, and they actually provide water for half of the population of Sao Paulo, so 9 million inhabitants, and they also provide the first industrial park in the country with 25% of the country's GDP. So that's to say that more than 30% of all of the production generated in Brazil and the GDP generated there needs water from the dams of Piracicaba. And so you can see that we've got 6 months of heavy rainfall and 6 months that are very dry. And so you can see that in terms of the effects of climate change, these droughts and dry spells are becoming very intense. We actually had historic droughts in 2014-2015, and right now we're facing up to a new difficulty. And this basically led us to come to some learnings And basically these are vis-a-vis the management of water resources in the region, which should be approached with a lot of cautiousness and a lot of forward planning and precise execution so as to avoid losses of valuable water for the Brazilian population and productive activity of the country. And so we can say that our current knowledge does not allow us to define good scenarios for the development of water and water usage. And we have to learn to work within a context of uncertainty. This can always come about, of course, and what are our main challenges? Well, we have to develop knowledge for management because it's the management that's fundamental to the outcome, and we have to be able to manage better. We have to be able to monitor better, and we have to dialogue with all actors involved, plan continuously and develop the capacities of all of those involved with water resources and their management. And obviously we have to learn from our mistakes. It goes without saying. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is an example of the water crisis that we went through. And as a result of this, we started to monitor much more intensely the rivers in our region. And this is a lot more precise and based on solid facts. And so as regards the different business as usual strategies that are undertaken at the moment, these continue to be quite traditional in nature with heavy water usage. And there's this vision of a future in which we still consume a lot of water. And so visions of a more rational use of water depend on short-term economic projects and visions. And some of these practices are only actually put into practice because they save money, not because of their ecological importance. And so we therefore have to develop a more balanced and planned vision, given that in our region we have many different risks when it comes to water security. With our Free Basin Agency, the PCJ, that of Piracicaba, Capivari and Jundiaí, we need to have each of our reserve basins very well managed to avoid more fundamental problems. And in order to do that, we have to work on funding resources and also basic sanitation. We have to promote the exchange of experiences and alliances. We have to strengthen institutions that participate in the system of management for public water resources and private water resources. And more than ever, we need to implement an agenda that's negotiated and that's orientated on sustainability and reduction of risks. And we can therefore extend our water security by doing so. Next slide, please. We have gone down a very long path in these 28 years of management. It's decentralized and participative. In 1923, when we actually set up our basin committee, we had 3.5 million inhabitants, 50% drainage or drains and 30% sanitation. And now we're talking about 90% and 78% for those last two figures, and our population's grown to 9,800,000. And so we can see that there's different tools that we have at our availability, and we have to be able to update our basin plan. And I think that we can come to be a good example of negotiated planning, and we can consolidate our main agenda around three main topics: recovery of water quality, so as to be able to keep the nutrients in and the contaminants out. We have to be able to provide water supply for human consumption, productive industry and the agricultural industry, which are our main usage. And we have to be very careful in terms of our use of underground water. And we have to educate people as regards environmental topics, communication and innovative technologies. We have to protect water sources with solutions that are based from within nature. And we have to come to a means of management that's based on governance. Okay, so this was a very short presentation on our Free Basin Agency. Thank you so much for having given me the opportunity to be here with you, and I'm here for any questions and information sharing that you might have. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much, Sergio, for these really interesting elements. We can see that you've obviously gone through a period of very intense droughts, and you've spoken for just a minute about the doubts that you had at the time. And so obviously we're speaking about not being adapted and how we have to be able to privilege certain measures over others, such as management of demands on water usage, sources, etc. And we have to basically just press ahead with determination, and we have to make sure that these measures are able to at least partially respond to the problem that we're faced with. So maybe we could deal with some of the questions that came through the chat first. So, Madame Eloat, there's some questions related to your economic resources, and from the point of view, this is a question coming from Jacques Guanalis. Is it that the water price has changed in Morocco, and has it evolved as a result of climate change? And then we have an additional question from Peter Novaks. Are you actually using financial resources so as to be able to stop people using so much water in the agricultural sector? Madame Elouat, you have the floor. So, as regards the fees for water usage, well, it depends on the usage. For drinking water, that takes into account of obviously real costs and people's actual ability to be able to pay those prices. It's obviously quite hard, therefore, to modify it and to change it from one year to the next. So we haven't changed it for some years now. And we do want to relaunch the debate so as to be able to change that tariff. But as regards the agricultural usage, this is cost that actually helps us a lot when it comes to being able to differentiate between the different resources in terms of their vulnerability, and their ability to differentiate and to pay one price here and one price there. And in terms of drinking water and agricultural use, they have to, in some regions, pay for square cubic meters at a higher price than others because there's water shortages in those areas. So it's based on usage, but as regards each usage, it's the socio-economic context that comes in as well, and other elements in parallel to that. The second question, the economic tools, so as to be able to incentivize savings of use of water in the agricultural sector. I would like to just talk about the national example, the national programme of water for irrigation. This was set up with the Green Morocco Plan Maroc Vert. And so basically we noticed that we're talking about agriculture making up more than 80% of the water usage in Morocco. And so it's generally traditional usages with massive water losses, or wastage of water, and so we want to basically install more economic water usage practices, especially when it comes to irrigation. And so we need to make sure that we don't start bleeding out water in that way, but we need to also continue to get the state to help us fund those types of projects. And at the moment, we are lucky enough to, on the whole, rely on quite a strong support from the state. And so we're able to do so, and we're able to impose these increased tariffs on those that can pay them per cubic metre in Morocco. Thanks very much. Edouard, can we now put up the survey that we'd planned on putting up? Okay, thank you. This is the survey. You can see there's 2 questions. The first is, do you already have a climate change adaptation plan? Yes, no, not applicable, depending on your actual setup. Second question, the main obstacle to adaptation in your water basin, is it political, economic, technical, or other type of obstacle or limitation that you'd be able to tell us about in the chat? So I'm going to give you the freedom to either respond to us right away in the chat box, or we've got about 20 minutes left, so I think that you're going to be able to have ample time to carry on with this. So I'm going to carry on with the questions and answers. Madame Jonio, there's questions about water assignation for water usage in critical areas, and we want to know whether the regulations for assigning water use permits depend on added value of the sectors involved. Yes, that actually is part of the whole challenge of water management, and we have to have this diversity of actors that are basically involved in water usage, one thing and the other. We're talking about people who work in town planning, farming, etc. Each one's going to have their own economic realities and their own needs that they bring to the table. And so we need to make sure that this is very much fairly spread out. So I think that in the work that's being led at the moment, the projections on different scenarios shows that these parameters, in some parameters there could be more of an impact than the others, and that the choices made are not often the best. So we can see that water is seen as a raw material, the projections only done at a midterm or to a midterm level, but it's not an infinite resource. That's the problem. So you can see that there's a top-down impact and it flows down. And so you can see that often this leads to negative outcomes. So often the approach is voluntary in nature, and the choice to adapt to climate change has a good rhyme to it when it comes to water tourism or tourism linked to water. That could bring a lot of jobs and dynamism to the area. And so we can see that there's volunteering opportunities linked to water. And we can see that we have to make sure that this has to be maintained, and we can see that basically the whole ensemble of the actors and the economic reality surrounding them is borne in mind, it's taken into account, and we have to really go about all of this in a sustainable way based on the entire area. Okay, I have an additional question for Madame Elawad that was actually asked by Guido Schmidt, but I think it's what Nyamida Giroli is also asking. which is that we notice often that policies to reduce consumption of water by agriculture don't often bear fruit, because the water that's saved is then used for other usages, and we don't actually reach the parameters that we wanted to reach. And so do you have any way in Morocco to basically opt for cultures that are less water use heavy in Morocco for cultural practices, to opt for some over others as a policy? I don't know if Mrs. Elawat is still with us. Yes. Hi, can you hear me? Yes. So a big part of the water that's saved is actually used for the extension of agricultural areas. For us, obviously, it's a first step. We want to change our culture so that it's more adapted to climate change. But the debate is still in its initial phases, I would say. And I would say that in the south of Morocco, it's actually quite strange. There are some areas, specific areas that are irrigated, that the actual farmers themselves go about this decision to change their practices because they just don't have enough water to maintain that heavy water usage. But we do know that there's still a lot to be done in terms of education on water, and we're taking it step by step. At the moment, what we're working on is through groundwater refresh programs, and we want to basically extend our areas where we limit the use of water so that the groundwater can recharge itself, and we can therefore keep using water where we still have more resource available, and that way we can try and bring about cultural change. It's still a debate that's on the table, but we need to help out those areas that are really water poor. Just an additional question. I know that in Brazil, in the Pijajota Basin, and in Morocco as well, there's a lot of grey, so to speak, agriculture. Madam, do you know, this is something that was asked by Peter Coex. Do you have any interesting examples of alternative water storage examples? And I think that Amira Martinez also asked, do you have an evaluation of the cost of not adapting in the basins that you've been working in? Well, as regards alternative measures, it's true that we do work a lot in these areas, at least at the French level. And so we're trying to come towards what we were talking about in the introduction, the MNER, as we call them, which is an acronym, but basically for putting in place basins that will actually regulate the desalination and make sure that we're able to orient that water towards recharging groundwater in other areas. And I think we have to really share experiences, because based on the fact that our point of view, these methods do actually allow for a strong water management on a technical level. And the second question, yes, do you have any examples of the cost of not adapting to climate change in the basins that you work in? Do you have any examples? Volunteerism examples, or... Yeah, actually there's a macroeconomic study. It's currently underway as regards sustainability, and I'm saying it's underway, I mean it's not quite finished yet, but it's to do with sharing. I can share the slide that I'm talking about here, the one I'm referring to. We can see that we're talking about this is quite voluntary at the moment, but at the time they were evaluated to the level of these figures I'm showing you here on the screen. Thank you very much for clearing that up. There's a general question from Marie Fadeliz. I'm going to read it. The current process of the revision of the treaty for seas and for water use out at sea and protecting hydraulic or water resources. Do you have any questions as regards? Do you have any comments as regards that point? Maritime water resources and their protection. Okay, if there's no answers, I think we could perhaps just leave it there for the moment on that point. Look, I think we're going to be able to now start our second session. So we don't have to go through absolutely all of the questions. If we have some time left afterwards, we can deal with that at the end of the second section. So we're now going to speak to Madam Sonia Koppel, who's Secretary of the Convention on Water, Co-Secretary for the Water and Health Protocol, and the Economic Commission of the for Europe, of the UN Economic Commission for Europe.
To speak in this webinar today, I will focus specifically on the situation of transboundary basins, which, as many of you know, actually cover 60% of freshwater resources worldwide. Can you see my screen? Okay, good. Okay. So this presentation was prepared together with my colleague Hanna Flutnikava, who is also working in the Secretariat of the Convention, of the Water Convention now. Yeah. So yeah, I'd also like to start actually by saying, as many of you know, that today is the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction of the United Nations, in recognition of the fact that more than 90% of disasters worldwide are actually water-related, particularly floods and droughts. And many of these disasters occur in shared basins shared by 2 or more countries. So why is it so important to cooperate in climate change adaptation? Because it can make adaptation more efficient and effective and to prevent maladaptation. By sharing data and information across border, also by enlarging the planning space and by locating the measures where they have an optimum effect, which can be sometimes in another country in the basins, and by identifying the best priorities from the basin perspective. So transboundary cooperation helps to address water-related disasters such as floods and droughts more efficiently. It helps to reduce uncertainties, and it can also support adaptation planning at the country level, that we'll see later on in my presentation. And finally, it can help even to share costs and benefits. And make thereby adaptation more efficient and even sometimes, in some cases, even reduce the costs. There is a global framework, which many of you know, the Water Convention, a convention on the protection and use of transboundary water courses and international lakes, which entered into force in 1996, and which is a unique now global legal and intergovernmental framework in the United Nations on transboundary cooperation over waters and also relevant for adaptation to climate change. We currently have 44 parties, including 3 from Africa, Chad, Senegal, and Ghana. And in the framework of the convention, the adaptation to climate change has come up very early. Already since 2000, there was work on floods and droughts in transboundary contexts. And then since in 2006, the Task Force on Water and Climate was created. And in this framework, we provide capacity building, sharing of knowledge and experience, guidance, development, and projects on the ground. This is also done in the framework of the Global Network of Basins working on climate change adaptation, in cooperation with the INBO, and in which framework we also carry out capacity building on financing transboundary adaptation and developing bankable projects for this. But now I would like to speak about what are the possible steps and then give a few examples, including the associated costs. So the recommended steps in transboundary climate change adaptation include first development of a basin-wide analysis of climate change impacts, basin-wide vulnerability assessments, and then developing ideally transboundary adaptation strategies and plans, and also considering here the costs and potential funding opportunities. So, for example, in the case of the Dniester, which I will speak about a bit later on, a joint implementation plan was developed, which includes cost and resource mobilization opportunities. In the Nitra Basin, a similar activity was done. Then it's also important to integrate transboundary adaptation into the basin and flood risk management plans, and certainly most important to actually implement priority adaptation measures of benefit to all basin countries. There are a number of good practices from around the world. For example, Chutalas, Danube, Dniester, Neman, Rhine, Meuse, Lake Victoria in Africa, Volta, OSS, Senegal, Mekong, Niger, but also many others which we are hearing here today of and in other occasions. So let me now give 3 quick examples of basins where such activities have been carried out. The first one is the Dniester Basin, shared by Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova. Here, already in 2009, a request came from the countries to support transboundary cooperation in addressing floods and droughts. As one of the many activities, with support from UNICE, OSCE, UNDP, and UNEP, a strategic framework for adaptation to climate change was developed and endorsed in 2015. And followed by an implementation and resource mobilization plan. These activities have not only helped to increase the adaptive capacity in the basin, but also actually facilitated transboundary cooperation more broadly by supporting the entry into force of the Transboundary Dniester Treaty in 2017 and the establishment of the Dniester Commission in 2018. And currently, activities are continuing, for example, by looking at measures and implementing measures in particular locations in the basin, and by developing also bankable project proposals for this. Another example is the Neman Basin. Oh, sorry, actually not the Neman. It's Chutalas Basin going to another region in Central Asia. This basin is shared by Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And with support from UNICE and UNDP, basin-wide modeling of climate change impacts was done. Then implementation measures were prioritized, which are useful for the whole basin, as well as a cost assessment was done, covering issues from water quality to monitoring and education. And these measures were integrated into the transboundary diagnostic analysis within the GF project and the strategic action program. The existing joint bilateral Chutalas Commission played a crucial role in this and created a climate change subgroup specifically charged to address climate change impacts. Then a third example, which UNICE is actually not directly involved in, but which I think is very illustrative, and we have not so much heard yet from the Asia region today. It's on the Mekong Basin. Here, the Mekong River Commission has worked on climate change over the last years and developed the Mekong Climate Change Adaptation and Action Plan, which helps to member countries to address transboundary risks and impacts, which also enables more efficient use of resources through cooperative action and knowledge and data sharing, including development of a basin-wide vulnerability assessment. And the Mekong River Commission also enhances the capacity of member countries in implementing their own national strategies and in raising funding from different sources. Now, I said I would speak a little bit about the costs, and indeed in some of these basins, cost assessments have been carried out. Cost assessment of adaptation, which has shown that the cost of adaptation is much lower compared to the cost of non-adaptation. So, for example, in the basins mentioned, approximate cost assessments were carried out using experts, using literature review and other methodologies. And they have shown that the costs for basin-wide adaptation measures are approximately around 200 million. And part of it can be covered from national sectoral programs and projects, but other parts have to be covered from other sources, such as international funding. In the Dniester Basin, this analysis was carried out in more detail. And here, for example, approximately 40% of the costs are related to flood protection measures, and approximately 1/4 is related to the preservation and restoration of ecosystems. Finally, since I have 1 minute left, I will try to conclude by giving some lessons learned, ingredients for success of transboundary adaptation. Why is it so important? And how can it actually be done, knowing how complicated it is? It often helps to start with a common technical issue of common concern. And that can be actually addressing floods and droughts jointly, can be other topics. Then good communication between different levels of administration and obviously between the countries is crucial. And having a consultative process involving both scientific experts and then the political level and also the different authorities from the regional to the basin and the national level. Data sharing and joint coordinated monitoring is a crucial basis. We have also seen that there's still a lack of capacity in many basins worldwide, and a lack of funding, because many of the global funds are now targeted to national and not so much, do not necessarily accept transboundary projects. Strong basin organizations are very important, but are not a prerequisite to work on the basin level. And finally, also the active engagement from civil society and private sector is recommended. And maybe a final conclusion. This year, when most countries worldwide are asked to develop their second nationally determined contributions under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it is very important that water and transboundary issues are included into these updated NDCs. And so we encourage you all to reach out to your colleagues working on these plans in order to include water and transboundary issues in there. And with this, I would like to conclude and maybe just say that the benefits of transboundary cooperation are obviously often much more qualitative than quantitative, such as also contribution to regional stability, to peace, to security, and we should also keep these benefits in mind when talking about the importance of transboundary cooperation and climate change adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Madame Sonia Koppel, for bringing this to light. It is true that at transboundary level and at the level of national basins, you have highlighted the importance of knowledge, the necessity to reduce uncertainty, and I believe you have also well demonstrated the opportunity that represents the legal framework suggested by the International Water Convention. You've mentioned the interest to exchange experiences and engage in international cooperation. We have well understood the strong messages you have expressed on transboundary processes of consultation, ownership, cost assessment, financing, and all the benefits you can expect and achieve thanks to this international cooperation. Thank you, and I have no doubt that there will be questions. Some of the questions written in the chat are already addressed to you. It's quite logical development of your intervention. We move to another continent, our fourth great witness, Mr. Lamine Ndiaye, Director for the Environment and Sustainable Development of the Organization for the Development of the Senegal River, that many of you know, the OMVS. Lamine, I give you the floor for around 10 minutes.
Juste avant de passer à la mine, je vérifie que l'interprétariat vers l'anglais est bien en place.
À la charge de Béa, oui, merci.
Edouard, vous pouvez afficher les diapos?
Ça va, on va l'afficher. À toi, Lamine. Merci.
So we're going to put up the slide. Thank you, Lamine. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Alain. I'd like to just say hi to everyone who's here to participate in this webinar. I'd like to present you to the organisation for the setting up and valuing of Senegal's rivers, the OMVS. As you can see, first off, we have a map here right now that shows the spatial evolution of the rainfall in our basin. As you can see, we've got our different reductions of different water inflow, but you can see that this is a basin that's also characterized by its differences and rainfall deficit. As you can see in these different graphs, you can see it was actually created in the great droughts of 1970s that actually spread into the 1980s, and this historical context actually set the basis for the climatic actions of our organisation, of the OMVS. And so I think that when we're talking about climate change, we have to talk about basically how much we can trust these models and how reliable they are. And I think that we have at the moment the problem of the models. So you can see that the models at the moment are sometimes chaotic, but they're intrinsic to the atmosphere. So I think that we don't have any sound. I think we lost Lamine. I think we might have lost our connection to Senegal. So I'll go on to the next slide. So this is a conclusion that right now, the only certitude that we have as regards the river basin in Senegal is that we have the evolutions and the climate in the basin is uncertain due to large uncertainties and important divergences, which concern most of the characteristics of the future climate in Africa, West Africa, that is, in particular in the river basin in Senegal. So the only area where we can see that there's a convergence of predictions, climatic predictions, that is, in the river basin, has to do with the evolution of tendencies of climate change. And the different work that we've consulted has all basically come to the same conclusion, that the average temperature of the basin will be higher than the average temperature that we observe currently. And as regards rainfall, the future rainfall is going to have obviously consequences on the non-fossil aquifers. And so we can see that there's been a certain there's been certain studies carried out on climate change and on adaptation that would be rolled out at the scale of the basin and would have national consequences. And we can see that we've used a lot of different images and the spatial aspect to see the evolution of the basin and the current context of climate change, the flooding, etc., in the Mon Valley and the Delta, which are unfortunately the most populated zones in our country. And we have a final study that tried to take together different models and come up with a more extended synthesis and came up with a similar prediction. As regards my following slide, we can see that these are the general conclusions for the next 5 to 10 decades to come. There's going to be a significant rise in the average temperature. There's going to be a reduction in average rainfall. Reduction that's going to be less significant but or less obvious, but still a reduction in sources that flow into the river basin in Guinea than in the rest of the basin. Then there's going to be average flow, there's going to be a reduction in average flow in the basin, and the relative convergence of this issue has led the authors of the updated hydrological monograph of the basin to conclude that the information that they currently have at their disposal as regards the future evolution of climate is still lacking in information in many different areas and is sometimes contradictory. The only thing that they can be acted upon is this verification that there is a regular reduction of the hydroelectricity of the rivers, so the amount of water in the rivers, signed Bader and Kochi, 2013. So I'm going to remind you that in 2003 we had to save the river that was completely submerged in water, and we had to really come to the aid of the population there. So I think that these extreme weather phenomena that become more and more significant are going to keep bringing development problems along with them, because this is a basin, as I say, with a very significant population, mainly made up of young people, and it's in the rural areas. And so we can see that when you're faced with that situation, in that sort of context, you're faced with all of the additional problems that entails. Next slide. So as to be able to manage this issue, we have been able to work on different areas and to basically link actions to knowledge, recent studies and research. So obviously when we come to study the basin, the studies that were undertaken before on the basin, the characterization study, the vulnerability study, etc., and the projections and scenarios, the climatic ones that we invested in within the basin can come to complement state action, and these actions are then developed from the state and also with development partners such as the World Bank that was able to grant us some investments in that area. Also the FAO, and we need to actually take actions on the grounds, whether we're talking about micro projects or other programs, and that could be the Guinea Basin's example, for example. And this basically led the population to stop deforestation practice, which they traditionally undertook, so as to promote preservation of important climatic resources. And we basically wanted to safeguard the natural resources of our basins. And this also leads us to take important decisions. And you can see that we're talking about concrete actions by regional actors, taken by regional actors, and by the 4 countries. And you can see that there's investments in the 4 areas, and you can see that there's potential to basically change the agricultural practices in agricultural sector, which is obviously the main user of water in our basin, and that could basically allow us to resolve the problem of food insecurity, which we currently experience. And we can boost our economy in this way, because tomorrow, when we're faced with conflicts of usage between population and the need to use water for irrigation and agriculture, and the use of drinking water, we want to make sure we're not in a complete impasse when it comes to those difficulties. We want to make sure this is the case in Guinea, Mali, Mauritania and Senegal. And so that's why we've undertaken very strict regulation policies as regards the basins on the Guinean part of it. So we want to really make sure that the basin can develop at the same time the workable land, or the agricultural ready land, the land that we can irrigate, and as regards water usage when it comes to transporting animals and agricultural products. And I think that each of us at our different levels, we all want to support. We want this support from the state, but these are the different measures that support us and that are able to basically mobilize financing on a sub-regional level, so that each of our 4 states can basically get those measures in place. And we've all got our different financial requirements, but on each of our 4 states, if we take care of our respective climate improvement projects and measures, we can see that these are things that we have to definitely do. We can't avoid doing them because of the situation that we currently find ourselves in. So I think that in terms of conclusions, the general remarks would be that we have our remarks on the leadership as regards climate change. We have to have these dependable models that we can rely on and that allow us to have a clear consensus as regards the future evolution of the river basins. As regards the temperature, we know we're sure about one thing: the temperature is going to go up. Even if from one bottle to the next, the actual temperature that it's going to go up to might change, we know that its temperatures are set to rise. As regards what we've been able to find out, as regards the risks of inaction, we're talking about 7 million people living around those countries with activities that are all centred on water usage. And so we know that it's basically essential to economic activity for livestock farming and other types of agricultural practices. And so we know that if we don't act now, we're really headed for disaster economically, which would of course bring with it social problems. I told you we've got 7 million, mostly young people, and we know that when we're talking about a population made up of usually young people, this can be especially heightened. And we have different areas that are classified. I'm going to give you 2 examples here. In the delta between Senegal and Mauritania, we have national parks that are of international importance, and they're actually shared by the monarchy, actually, but they cover the water basin in Senegal, and that's why we have to act there, so as to be able to preserve the health of our basins, and that's why we really want to undertake voluntary water preservation activities, because our adaptation strategy, which is our support, is based on 5 axes: recognizing competencies, development of rural communities, support by larger works, and risk prevention, as well as the reinforcement of different measures and regulations so as to support these plans. And we're talking in general about 7 billion or 6,500,000. No, sorry, 25 million, 7 million euros on the short term, and we've got 25 million euros from here to 2050. And so I would like to just say that this is a support that's perhaps not really robust enough to do everything that we need to do to preserve the population that lives around the basin. But that's our main issues that I want to set out to you as regards our river basin in Senegal and the surrounding areas. So I wanted to set out to you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lamine. The experience is actually really, really essential for all of us. And we know that the only certainty that you have is that the situation in the river basin is uncertain. And I think that rings true for a lot of people. We know that the temperatures are going to go up. We know that rainfall is going to reduce. That is a global tendency. And we know also there's going to be an increase in extreme weather events. They're going to be taking place more frequently, and so therefore it's really necessary to be able to rely on consolidation of approaches both nationally and internationally. I can see that there's a question in the chat about the fact that that's going to really be fundamental for healthcare in the future, and that these requirements may actually help in some way to force us to adapt. I don't know, Edward, if we can see the results of the poll, but I think on the first question, do you have a climate change adaptation plan? You can see that there's some participants that are not directly concerned, they're not applicable, but when we see those that are, you'd say it's almost more reflective of 60% there of those who are. And some of them might have been putting their plans in place in the past 5 years, but about 40%, if we take the non-applicables and spread them between the two, don't. And so this is quite a significant number when we think of how many climate change plans might actually be necessary. And we know that the fact that we have to really, in order to get operational, sometimes there's still a gap that has to be filled there. And so the next question was the main obstacle to adaptation is, and we can see, well, that political factors are pretty predominant here, and we can see that 40% are economic. So we can see that together 80% of the basins have a political economic difficulty when it comes to setting up adaptation plans, and then it's either technical or other cultural, social obstacles, right? Thank you so much for those responses. I actually have 2 or 3 questions left. I don't know, after those we'll be able to actually conclude our seminar, but there's a question from Pakistan from Sonia. And so that's something that's complicated at the moment. And so we can see that these are questions that have been impacted by climate change. And so to what extent is the United Nations able to play a role to intervene in those types of situations and to act on those thematic areas? That is a question from Islam Ake in Pakistan.
For the question. And certainly politically difficult regions such as the one you mentioned make cooperation on water and climate change much more difficult. But just to give one example of a basin where there was also a very difficult relation between the two countries. Basically, in one basin in the Pan-European region, there was no cooperation at all at political level between the two countries. And then one of the two countries requested us, so the United Nations, to engage. And we organized the first meeting mainly at expert level. And then we started to promote the cooperation between the two countries at expert level, at scientific level, by actually developing, comparing first the models which already existed between the scientists from the two sides, and then developing, trying to find common points. And later on, we started to implement trust building measures such as doing a joint field trip along the river and having different meetings starting to involve also more authorities. And later on, after a few years of cooperation, this led to actually a joint transboundary adaptation strategy. So this just to say that it can be still possible to start cooperation between experts at technical level and to try to find issues of which are still priorities for the two countries, which can be sometimes also other topics outside the water sector, such as biodiversity or others. But there's certainly no recipe and no one size fits all. And the final point, as you might know, another entry point for cooperation in such difficult cases can also be the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, for which there is now the SDG target 6.5, which asks all countries to implement integrated water resources management at all levels, including through transboundary cooperation. And there is even an indicator dedicated to measuring progress on this. And this can also be an entry point. UNESC and UNESCO are the custodian agencies at the global level for this indicator 6.5.2, and it can be an occasion for countries to submit data and to work at basin level, even in difficult circumstances, as we have seen in some other regions in the world. But I would be happy to exchange further with you separately if, to discuss the situation further. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Sonia.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I think that there's someone who wants to intervene from the Institute, Ado. I think that as Mrs. Caroline Maillot, who participated in the 2000 in the latest study, wanted to comment on. I don't know, Mrs. Shosako, are you there? Hi, yeah. I don't know if you can hear me well. Yes, fine, thank you. Yeah, I don't actually have specific costs to communicate to you. It's true that everything that we were able to provide to you in terms of costs is not something that we've developed ourselves, but what we have tried to develop in the Indoor Institute is the evolution, if you like, of the socio-economic context. And so to try and compare this in a way that's, how could I put this? Okay, the objective for us is more like to compare the indicators rather than to give specific figures, because we're not going to try and do it on the scale of a whole range of different activities that we try and have in mind at the moment. And there's obviously also studies that have been that we've been charged with carrying out, but we wanted to choose the indicators that speak most about the situation of the basins, and with the socio-economic indicators, and in parallel the impact on water resources. And so as a result of that, we've tried to foresee the outcomes in terms of the scenarios that we proposed that were put together with the input of the actors in the basins. So you have the impact on health, different groups, and communities, actors, and different actions that are proposed, what would happen if we were to do this or the other. And it was interesting to see that actually, as regards one scenario that was actually put together by these actors, we said, look, in this one scenario we placed the economy and the economic development of the territory above everything else, and so we see water resources as a primary raw material rather than the resources to be protected. We can see that these water resources continue to become degraded and to be worn down with the heavy cost that involves. And then we could see that there's different ruptures in terms of the different activities. And so it became clear that we have to preserve that precious resource. And then as regards the, even if we have a positive social development in the area, so we don't actually have like specific figures that say this is what's going to happen here, that's going to happen there. We tried to choose it, so it was always orientated as regards prioritising reduction in water and making sure that reduction in water use was also always a positive input in terms of socio-economic development. So I think that we're able to do so without concretely going in on that basis, and so we can see that when what's going to come out is a catastrophic result, the costs of water usage are just going to keep spiralling. Okay, thank you very much, Madame Chaillot, for having basically set out the main axes of your work. I'm now going to give a last question to Lamine in as regards the geopolitical situation in Mali and whether this actually affects water resources and the work of the WHO, the work of your organisation, sorry. Yes, it's true that that's difficult. We actually have a council with the ministers and the head of state, but there are difficulties that are obviously come about at that level, societal difficulties that we have. But at the moment when big decisions are made, they do get in contact with us at our organisation for the valuing of our river basin. And so I think that sometimes though, when we're not kept abreast and where there's different meetings that take place and we're not involved, then that's obviously problematic. But I think that we have the different dams that have been built and those that are in construction. And I think that the difficulties with the dams is that right now they're based exclusively on Mali, and maybe we need cooperation with other dams in different countries. But there is this handicap, you're right, but we're in communication with our president and we don't think it's going to stop us in the future from having this better governance that we want to have. Nevertheless, as regards small technical activities, we are able to get moving with those.
Thank you, Lamine, for your insights on this issue. I'm going to now pass the floor to Eric for the conclusions of our webinar. I'm sorry that we were not able to take every single questions, but we are currently late and had to privilege questions that came from the chat. You are of course invited to send us any additional questions you may have by email, and we will be pleased to provide a reply. We can clearly see that water is the first victim of climate change. The examples presented throughout the webinar clearly and accurately demonstrated that. The business case, the economic model, is not easy to write or to translate into figures. At local level, the uncertainty is quite high when it comes to climate evolution scenarios, impacts on water resources, its availability, or its geographic distribution. Knowledge still needs to be strengthened on the resources, on water resources use, on their evolution and the relationship between science, climatic models, local decision makers, and economic sectors that are going to be heavily impacted.
But uncertainty is not an excuse. That's an important point to take home. That's an important takeaway message. We have to, all the same, still build a pathway to adaptation within our water basins, and I think that it's become very clear that there's still a lot to be done on the part of our water basins so as to adapt to climate change and to lessen the impact on water resources, including surface water and underground water resources. And so how are we going to associate users or end customers of water usage with this effort, and how we're going to envisage solutions to put in place, and how we're going to envisage bad examples of non-adaptation, things that are based on nature. We've got perhaps grey style infrastructure that's showing its limits, and so we really need to face up to the need to act, because this is going to continue to be on the agenda of international negotiations. The Conference of the Parties on Climate always prices up the cost of inaction, and there's obviously really valid reasons to do that, but at the same time, in parallel, we have to continue to be the voice that shouts out for the importance of this adaptation. And I think that it's become very clear the work that still needs to be done so as to meet those challenges. And we have to make sure that these challenges are faced in a way that's shared between us. And I think that in terms of a conclusion, I think that we have to really work with a whole range of partners. We've been doing so since COP21 in Paris. We've prepared a manual in terms of adaptation to climate change. In 2019, we prepared a new manual on projects for adaptation in cross-border water basins with sponsorship from the World Bank. And then by the same token, we also had to launch an initiative that was solely dedicated to Africa, and that was with 100 projects that dealt with water and climate that you can see here, and that I should mention are still open for contributions, and they put calls out for contribution. Then we can see that we have to work on alliances between companies and alliances so as to desalinate salt water. And we can see that there's different alliances that through different action groups are becoming interested in this subject. And you can see that the next event on these innovation aspects and the need for innovation as regards the adaptation, climatic adaptation, will take place on the 24th of October of next year. And so I think that the next webinar that we'll offer, so you've got the one on the 24th of October, and then you've got RIOB, which is in 1 month, which is totally online. And then you'll see this on the screen, but also on our website, the different sessions that are being prepared. And you'll see that in September, there'll be a new webinar that will talk about actors, the participation of civil society and young people's collaboration and participation in river basin organizations. In 2021, we're going to try and organize a webinar each month And so if you do have suggestions to make to us, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us on the email address that you can see. Oh, we can't see the screen sharing anymore. I'm really sorry. You'll have that presentation, rest assured, and everything's on our REOB website. Please don't leave us immediately, because this is the point where we want everyone to actually turn on their webcams again, and we'll take a so-called family photo. We hope that the infrastructure plays ball and bears with us, and we'll try and have the maximum amount of videos available. So we can see different copies of these screenshots with the different videos that are put up there, and so that will be really important for the communication. So we're going to stop speaking. I'm going to try and stop speaking so I don't come out speaking in the photo. Edouard, can we stop? Okay, thank you very much. And listen, I think we're going to now progress towards the end of this webinar. Thank you to all of our speakers who, in very succinct ways, have basically broadened our knowledge of what we knew was going on in the basins. Thank you, Alan, for the moderation. Thank you to the interpreters. Thank you, Edward, for taking care of the technical side of things, and all of the technical colleagues that are taking part in that side of things behind the scene. Can't even imagine them. So there was almost 150 of us at the height of our webinar, with 3 languages available, which enabled us to work with people from different geographies. Thank you so much to everyone.